Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, Summer Session 2019. So in this video, I will be going over the question for Part A of our exam, Exam 1. I'll be going over question number 5. Compare the Chariot Analogies as presented by Yamaraja in the Katha Upanishad, Nagasena in Questions to King Malinda, and Socrates in Plato's The Phaedrus. Which sounds more reasonable to you? Why? So the chariot analogies of Yamaraja in the Katha Upanishad and Nagasena in the Questions to King Malinda, we've already gone over those chariot analogies, and they're opposite. So in the Katha Upanishad, the chariot analogy is that the soul is a passenger in the chariot, and the horses are your sense organs pulling the chariot down the road. And you have to control your senses in order to achieve the end of the road, which is Vishnu, the supreme soul, the ultimate controller in the highest place of the cosmos. The chariot analogy, the Buddhist chariot analogy from the Buddhist monk Nagasena, and his discussion with King Malinda, the Greek King Malinda, is the opposite, because they don't believe in an individual soul. At least Nagasena doesn't, and he's convincing the king of this. So in that, so I'll turn to that. So the Katha Upanishad chariot analogy is on page 213 of our book. So here's our book, Introduction to World Philosophy, a Multicultural Reader. On page 213 is the Katha Upanishad, and on page 225 is Nagasena's chariot analogy, and then Plato's chariot analogy in the Phaedrus on page 257 is very similar to the Hindu chariot analogy in the Katha Upanishad. The soul is a passenger on the chariot, pulled by your sense desires. But Plato's is slightly different, and we'll go over the details. But first, I'll go back over the Katha Upanishad and then Nagasena's, and then I'll go into more depth into the Phaedrus, because that's the one we haven't gone over yet. So very quickly, on page 213, the Katha Upanishad, it's the Brahmin boy Nachiketas. He's in the underworld. He's speaking to the god of death, Yamaraja. Yama means death. Raja is king. And he wants to know what happens to the soul after death. So he's talking to death personified. He's dead himself. His father had to kill him because he created some consternation during a fire sacrifice. I explained that in the previous videos about the Upanishads. So I'll just pick up with the chariot analogy. So after he convinces Yamaraja to tell him about the nature of the soul, this is how death replies. On the right-hand column of page 213. Know the self to be sitting in the chariot, the body to be the chariot, the intellect, the charioteer, and the mind, the reins. The senses they call the horses, the objects of the senses their roads. So he who has no understanding and whose mind is never firmly held, his senses are unmanageable like vicious horses of a charioteer. So skipping down a little bit, he who has no understanding, who is unmindful and always impure, never reaches that place, but enters into the round of births. But he who has understanding, who is mindful and always pure, reaches indeed that place from whence he is not born again. But he who has understanding for his charioteer and who holds the reins of the mind, he reaches the end of his journey, and that is the highest place of Vishnu. So this is literally in a cosmology of concentric spheres, which I've spoken of previously. The outermost sphere in some of the Upanishads is called the ether, which is a translation of the word akasha. And it's you might have heard the term akashic record. It's where the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe are conserved, and they radiate inward to create this illusion of space and time. So the chariot analogy in the Katha Upanishad is that our body is a chariot, the mind is the reins which connect our sense perceptions, our sights and smells and tastes and touches and the sounds we hear. Those sense perceptions are connected to objects of sense perception which become objects of desire. So our desires to see, to hold something we see, or eat something that we smell and want to taste it, and our senses compel us to move. They're the horses. And the charioteer is your intelligence. So if the charioteer knows that we don't want to go let the horses lead the chariot, we want to lead the chariot towards the real goal, which is the supreme Vishnu, which is just the word for God, the omnipresent source of everything. That's how you get there. And if you can get all the way to Vishnu at the outermost horizon of the cosmos, then you do not have to be born again in the cycle of reincarnation. But if you don't, and you let your horses pull you hither and thither, then you'll perpetually be reincarnated. Okay, so moving on to page 225 for the Buddhist Chariot Analogy by the monk Nagasena. He was speaking to King Malinda. King Malinda said, what's your name? And then, or who are you? He says, all right, on page 224, and King Malinda asked the monk Nagasena, how is your reverence known, and what is your name, sir? So then Nagasena gets into this explanation of, well, people call me Nagasena, but that's just a name. Really, there's no individual self. And his point is, we don't stay the same from one moment to the next. There's no substance that endures from moment to moment that you could call a self. There's just a constantly fleeting flux of sense perceptions, and there is no individual self. The idea that you are an individual self is the source of all your desires, which lead to suffering. So to release yourself from the suffering cycle of reincarnation, you have to realize that you don't even exist as a self. So that's the Buddhists' anatman, no atman. They reject the individual soul. And this is the difference of their chariot analogy. So when the king says, oh, what do you mean? It's just the name, there's no self. What about, who am I giving medicines to feed the sick? If someone was to kill you, no one really would have killed anybody. So me as the king wouldn't have to go hunt down the murderer because no one did anything. So it doesn't make any sense to say there's no such thing as a self. So Nagasena doesn't react to those questions, but he uses an analogy of his own. He says, Your Highness, your feet are very weak. I'm sure you didn't walk here. You must have taken a chariot. Yes, I came on a chariot. And he says, oh, and this is on page 225, the left-hand column. Is then the axle the chariot? No, reverend sir. Is it then the wheels, or the framework, or the flagstaff, or the yoke, or the reins, or the goad stick? No. So none of these things put together is the chariot. And so then Nagasena says, so you lied. You didn't come on a chariot. There's no such thing as a chariot. There's a bunch of different parts temporarily put together. So then on the right-hand column in the middle, but King Malinda said to Nagasena, I have not, meaning Nagasena, spoken a falsehood, for it is in dependence on the pole, the axle, the wheels, the framework, the flagstaff, etc., that there takes place this denomination, chariot, this designation, this conceptual term, a current appellation, and a mere name. And then Nagasena says, you're right. That's a good answer. It's just a name referring to this temporary combination of different body parts, or for the chariot of different parts. And similarly, you might call yourself a self, but that's just a word referring to an ever-changing assembly of body parts and emotions that are bundled together. The word is skandhas. So that's really what the chariot analogy is trying to say. There is no self, just like there is no chariot. It's just a word referring to a temporary assembly of parts. Okay, so that was all a review, considering we've gone over that before. Now we move on to fresh material in the Phaedrus by Plato. So page 257. All right. So Socrates is the famous philosopher from Greece who wandered the streets of Athens questioning people about things like what is justice, what is beauty, and people would give an answer. Socrates would point out the flaws with the answer. They'd go back and forth trying to fine-tune their definitions of these essential terms. And we'll be going over the Phaedo, which was the dialogue that recounts Socrates' last day before he was executed by the city-state of Athens for corrupting the youth and believing in gods of his own invention instead of the state gods. So that we'll be doing in the next video. Here in the Phaedrus, though, we're just going to focus on the chariot analogy. So he's trying to describe what a soul is. So on page 257, this is Plato, who's a student of Socrates, writing down dialogues describing how Socrates talks to other people. And this is Socrates, we don't hear any of the other interlocutors with whom he's speaking. This is just Socrates describing the nature of the soul. So the left-hand column, page 257, he says, "Of the nature of the soul, though her true form is ever a theme of large and more than mortal discourse, let me speak briefly and in a figure." So he's admitting it's almost impossible to adequately describe the soul, but here's my shot. "And let the figure be composite, a pair of winged horses and a charioteer." So already you see a slight difference from the Katha Upanishad. The horses here have wings, and there's only two. It's not the five senses. It's just two. One of the horses represents all of your sense desires, all of your appetites, and the other horse represents your sense of righteous indignation. It's very similar to the three gunas that we described in a previous video from the Hindu philosophy: sattva guna, rajaguna, tamaguna, the mode of goodness, passion, and ignorance. So the mode of goodness, sattva guna, those are the three elemental strands, they call them, like ropes that permeate the universe, and the way that they knot together creates everything. Everything material, which includes the mind, matter, material objects, and psychological objects. They're all created by proportions of these three gunas. And this chariot analogy in the Phaedrus, I think it helps to keep the three modes of nature in mind, because the two horses are the two lower modes, the mode of passion, rajaguna, and the mode of ignorance, tamaguna, which is the appetites, the bodily desires. So we're just developing the chariot analogy here. "And let the figure become a pair of winged horses and a charioteer. Now the winged horses and the charioteer of the gods are all noble and of noble descent." So the demigods have the same setup, but their horses are absolutely obedient to the intelligence of the divine gods, whereas for mortals it's a different story. So the next paragraph down. I'll endeavor to explain to you how the mortal differs from the immortal creature. The soul in her totality has the care of inanimate being everywhere and traverses the whole heaven, appearing in diverse forms. So again, this is an introductory class. We can't get too deep into the fine details, but notice he says the soul in her totality traverses the whole heaven. So this is similar to the Hindu concept of Atman. There's a supreme Atman, and then there's all the individual Atmans that are reincarnating because of falsely identifying with the material body. So this seems to be something like that. The soul traverses the whole heaven, but appears in diverse forms. There's one soul that appears as many. So continuing here, "When perfect and fully winged, she soars upward and orders the whole world." So like in the Hindu conception of the ether, similarly for Plato, the whole material world is ordered by the outermost sphere where the absolute ideas exist, which we're coming to. And this is going to be important when we compare Plato to Aristotle and their different takes on the theory of absolute forms or the perfect ideas. So continuing here, "The imperfect soul, losing her wings and drooping in her flight, at last settles on solid ground." Okay, so the souls who are perfect can rise to the outermost sphere of the universe. So that's where they perceive the idea of absolute beauty, of absolute justice, of absolute goodness. And that strengthens their soul, it nourishes their soul. Whereas those who are infatuated with the material body, though they strive to make it to that outermost sphere, they fall back down to earth because of the weight of their habitual addiction to bodily pleasures. So this is what they're recounting here, is souls in between incarnations in material bodies. And it's another near-death experience kind of a explanation that we see also in the Katha Upanishads. In Plato's Republic, which the editors of the book mention in the introductory notes to this chapter on Plato, chapter 9, the Republic ends with also a near-death experience of a soldier named and there too the soul goes out to the outermost sphere, which contains all of the information of the inner spheres. If you look at Plato's dialogue with Timaeus, it's the same cosmology. The reason I stress that is not only because that's the ultimate goal in Plato's cosmology and in the Katha Upanishad and other Upanishads, but because, as I've mentioned in previous videos, it's very similar to holographic string theory as developed by the Stanford string theorist Leonard Susskind and his Nobel Prize-winning partner Gerard 't Hooft. So that's the newest cutting-edge cosmology, that the past, present, and future of this universe are interwoven, smeared out at every point of the outermost horizon of the cosmos, where space-time is expanding away from Earth at the speed of light. And they radiate back in to create the holographic illusion of three-dimensional space evolving over time by projecting these elastic fundamental threads of energy. So it's very similar to Plato's cosmology and the Hindu cosmology, especially when we enter in Plato's cosmology, that near-death experience at the end of the Republic has these threads of destiny that trace a soul back from the horizon to whatever, to the life on Earth that it takes. So this is a very similar near-death experience in the Phaedrus here. So I'll just continue to read here. On the right-hand column near the bottom, the demigods, he describes them, they go out to the outermost sphere of the universe. But when they go up to banquet and festival, then they move up the steep to the top of the vault of heaven. The chariots of the gods in even poise, obeying the rein, glide rapidly. But the others labor, for the vicious steed goes heavily, weighing down the charioteer to the earth when his steed has not been thoroughly trained. This is the hour of agony and extremest conflict for the soul, for the immortals, when they are at the end of their course, go forth and stand upon the outside of heaven. The revolution of the spheres carries them round, and they behold the things beyond. But of the heaven which is above the heavens, what earthly poet ever did or ever will sing worthily? I'll describe it, for I must dare to speak the truth, when truth is my theme. There abides the very being with which true knowledge is concerned. The colorless, formless, intangible essence, visible only to the mind, the pilot of the soul. The divine intelligence, being nurtured upon mind and pure knowledge, and the intelligence of every soul, capable of receiving the food proper to it, rejoices at beholding reality, and once more gazing upon truth, she is replenished and made glad until the revolution of the world brings her round again to the same place. In the revolution, on the outermost sphere of the universe going round, he says, in the revolution, she, the soul, beholds justice and temperance and knowledge absolute, not in the form of generation or of relation, which men call existence, but knowledge absolute in existence absolute, beholding the other true existences. So the chariot is your body, the charioteer is your intellect, and the two horses in this analogy, one is the sense of righteous indignation, I call it, because it wants to obey the intellect, but the other horse is the bodily appetites, which is always dragging its partner horse away. And so that's very similar to the Katha Upanishad chariot analogy, but I think what is really important to focus on is the idea that the absolute ideas exist out at that outermost sphere of the universe. So for Plato, this entire material world is like a dream projection from an absolute spiritual world. It's very similar to the Hindu philosophy of the Upanishads. For Plato, every material thing that you see is a reflection of some absolute form of that thing. So, for example, and I've used this in other videos for other classes, here's a pen. Here's one pen, here's another pen. They're very similar. Plato would say, through Socrates, that each of these pens is a temporary image projected from the absolute, perfect, eternal idea of what a pen should be. And that all the, it's not just for concrete things like pens or trees, but for abstract concepts like justice and beauty, all of the beautiful things and people and animals that you see in the material world, what is it that makes them called beautiful? What is that one common element that allows us to apply the word beauty to them all? What is the essence of beauty? So that idea of beauty exists for Plato as a real spiritual thing, specifically at the outermost sphere of the universe, and that when you die, your soul, which is compared to a chariot, so, and this is another important point here, that in the Katha Upanishad, the chariot is the body. In the Phaedrus, this chariot is actually the soul itself. It's not the material body, because this is when you're out of your material body. So it's more like the subtle material body of your mind. And the two horses, again, aren't exactly the bodily sense desires. They're just desire itself, one of the horses, and the other horses is more like the mode of passion, Rajaguna, which is trying to keep the lower mode of ignorance, Tamaguna, in check, but it just usually doesn't have the strength to do it, and that lower mode of nature pulls the whole soul back down into a material body. So that's an important distinction as well. So there are minor distinctions, but the main cosmology is the same, which is that the soul is striving to achieve reunion with God, or Vishnu, at the outermost sphere of the universe. And the medieval Christian theologians like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, they interpreted these ideas that Plato was talking about to be the ideas in God's mind. So when God created the universe, God created trees. God has the perfect idea of tree in his mind, and then he creates many trees that are imperfect replicas of that perfect idea. But when you get out to the outermost sphere of the universe, in between your material incarnations, according to Plato, you can perceive the absolute idea of beauty, of justice, of tree, of rabbit, of every single thing. They're all contained with the universal soul out there at the outermost boundary, spherical boundary of space. So I think, so let's just recap very briefly. For the Upanishad, Katha Upanishad and Plato, there's an eternal soul that reincarnates through material bodies, and the chariot for the Katha Upanishad is the body, the horses are the senses. Whereas for Plato, the chariot seems like the subtle material body, the mind, and the two horses are your sense desires and also the passionate desire to not be enslaved by your bodily desires. And they struggle with each other. And that's very similar to the three gunas, which is part of Hindu philosophy. Sattva guna would be the intellect, Tamaguna, the ignorant mode of nature, would be the bodily desires, and Rajaguna is the mode of passion in between that tries to obey the intellect, but usually is overcome by the ignorant desires of Tamaguna. And in the Buddhist chariot analogy by the monk Nagasena, the chariot is an analogy for the self. Just like there is no self, it's just a word, a name for a bunch of temporarily connected skandhas or bundles of sense perceptions and emotions. So to a chariot, it's just a word that applies to temporarily collected assembly of parts like the axle and the wheels and so on. So that will cover it for the chariot analogy comparison. I will now, so that was part A for exam 1, question number 5. I'm going to now go back and cover question 4. Which do you prefer, Plato's theory of the soul or Aristotle's? So I will get to that in the next video.